Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we're going to look at the foundation and influencing factors that contribute to trade, especially the highly interconnected global trading network that we have built. Trade seems to be a pretty simple process. One state exchanges goods and services with another state. But there are two underlying factors that contribute to trade. Comparative advantage is a country's ability to produce one product much more efficiently than it can produce other products within its economy. By producing something more efficiently, it creates a cost advantage through economies of scale. But comparative advantages can come in many different forms. A country may have a comparative advantage in labor because they have a huge workforce that will work for relatively low wages, like textiles that are produced in Bangladesh or Vietnam. Another country may have a highly skilled workforce to produce high-end goods, like the four Asian tigers of South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. These countries invested in having a comparative advantage in human capital. They invested heavily in education and training, and many high-tech companies, like Samsung in South Korea, have become global brands. As a result, South Korea's development has improved dramatically in a relatively short period of time. Another country may have a comparative advantage in climate and are able to produce a luxury crop like coffee that generates high demand elsewhere. A great example of comparative advantage are the Arabian Peninsula states, countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that have a comparative advantage when it comes to a raw material, oil. This is something that is in demand around the world, particularly in the global core. From an economic standpoint, it can be advantageous for countries to produce and export a select range of goods that they can produce efficiently, and then to buy other goods and services from countries that can more efficiently provide them. The other major aspect that is required for trade is complementarity. Complementarity refers to the mutually beneficial trade relationship between two countries that results when they have different comparative advantages. In general, countries export goods that they have a relative advantage in producing in exchange for goods that are less expensive to import than to produce internally. For example, Mexico imports specialty apples from the United States, and the United States imports avocados from Mexico because it's more expensive to grow them in their own countries than to import them. Because of comparative advantage and complementarity, global output of goods has increased dramatically as countries produce more goods more efficiently. As a result, international trade has skyrocketed in the last century. In 2018, more than half of the world's GDP was generated through international trade, compared to only about a quarter of the world's GDP in 1960. But 10 countries account for more than 50% of the total world trade in goods and services. China is the world's leader in the trade of goods, while the United States is the leader in international services that are traded. But some governments seek to protect domestic industries from more efficient competitors in other countries. One way they may do that is through tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imported goods and services. The goal of tariffs is to give domestic businesses an advantage by taxing foreign competitors' imported products and making them more expensive. This enables a domestic company to offer goods at a lower price than their foreign competitors. But tariffs limit free trade and reduce competition, which usually results in higher prices for consumers. So let's look at one example of the impact of tariffs. In late 2018, the United States imposed tariffs on a wide range of goods imported from China, to which China retaliated with tariffs on US goods like agricultural products like soybeans. Ultimately, costs increased for consumers, and for affected businesses, they saw a decline in sales as a result. But other government policies can have an impact on economic development. We will examine international free trade agreements in more detail in just a moment. But at the national scale, governments may provide incentives to try and attract businesses. These incentives can range from favorable tax obligations or subsidies to more lax environmental or safety standards. At the local scale, municipalities may offer tax breaks as well, but may also offer low-interest loans, provide reliable transportation and communication networks, or workforce training programs to try and attract companies. For example, when Amazon was looking to expand to another city for a second headquarters, cities offered billions of dollars in public subsidies, as well as tax reductions, transportation improvements, abundant land for relatively cheap, as well as other more unique offers like cactuses, hockey shoutouts, and renaming streets after Alexa. But governments implement these policies at a variety of scales, with the goal being to improve economic development and the standard of living for their citizens. But in general, more governments have moved toward deregulation, or removing government rules on things like trade. And this is part of a larger movement called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a set of beliefs that favor free market capitalism, in which trade has no constraints from government. So privatization and deregulation are key components of neoliberalism. Basically, the idea behind neoliberalism is by removing barriers to trade, there will be higher standards of living, fewer tensions between countries, and it will support the diffusion of democracy and basic human rights. Free trade agreements between countries have helped to remove or reduce barriers like tariffs and have promoted greater trade between member states. Free trade agreements also promote foreign investment in other countries, particularly in countries of the periphery and semi-periphery. So let's look at some of the organizations who have promoted greater amounts of free trade. We'll begin with the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which is a supranational organization with over 150 member states. Its primary focus is to make sure trade happens as freely as possible. It works to negotiate trade agreements and resolve trade disputes between countries. It also attempts to remove barriers to free trade like tariffs, import quota systems, and discourages protectionist policies. The European Union is a free trade agreement at its core, as it has eliminated tariffs and trade quotas between its member states. The EU is also classified as a customs union, meaning that there is a single unified external trading policy for non-members. So while all internal tariffs have been removed, there is a common tariff policy for countries that are not part of the bloc. This allows the European Union to operate as a single market, a single trading bloc, thereby maximizing the influence of the entire union. Mercosur is a Spanish acronym for the Southern Common Market, which was established as a customs union and a regional trading bloc for South American countries, specifically Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, commonly called OPEC, started as 5 oil-producing countries in 1960, but currently includes 13 countries across Southwest Asia, Latin America, and Africa. It was created to avoid competition among oil-producing countries. They account for almost half of the world's oil production and roughly 60% of the global oil trade. OPEC recently speculated that current members account for almost 80% of the Earth's proven oil reserves. Their decisions impact much of the world economy by influencing oil supply and oil prices, which is significant because so many countries depend on it for industry and economic development. The reality for each of these organizations is that by promoting trade without tariffs or other obstacles, they have dramatically increased global movement of goods and services, thereby improving levels of development and increasing interdependence among countries. As global trade has increased, countries have increasingly relied on one another for many things, leading to a high degree of interdependence. Multinational corporations like Apple, Microsoft, and Nike, among many others, have investments and operations in many countries of the developing world. This provides a cheaper source of labor than these multinationals would find in the global core, but also provides employment opportunities in the periphery and semi-periphery. It's true that these wages are lower compared to core countries, but they're often much higher than other alternatives within the periphery and semi-periphery. In addition, these jobs help to diversify developing economies. The World Bank helps to reduce poverty and promote sustainable development around the world. It works alongside governments and multinational corporations to develop infrastructure, ensure safe drinking water, improve sanitation systems, build new schools, and improve transportation and communication networks. In general, the high state of interdependence in the global economy has helped to improve levels of development around the world. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, is an international lending agency with nearly 200 member states. It works to promote global cooperation and financial stability. They also help to facilitate trade, like the WTO, and promote sustainable development, like the World Bank. The IMF also provides loans to countries that are deeply in debt. These loans can be offered with no interest to developing countries, but they often come with conditions that countries must put into action. This can include austerity measures, which may include tax increases, spending cuts, or both, with the goal being to cut countries' budget deficits. But collectively, the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization work to promote global economic growth, advance free trade, and encourage countries to work together. Global interdependence hasn't been completely beneficial. It's important to remember that scale matters. So while generally many people have benefited from an increasingly globalized economy, Many other people have lost their jobs and livelihoods as more efficient systems have emerged in other regions or countries. So keep that in mind. In addition, as our global economy has become increasingly interconnected, risks of financial crises persist. A financial crisis now is far more likely to negatively affect virtually every country in the world. In fact, a worldwide recession occurred in 2007 to 2008, which was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. So let's provide a very brief, very general account of what happened in the Great Recession. In the United States, home prices peaked and then started to plummet. Many people were unable to make their mortgage payments, so banks, who had authorized risky mortgages during the boom period, took a huge hit. Some went bankrupt and others were bailed out by the US government with trillions of dollars, which we should note shows how important government initiatives can be. But the crisis then spread to other companies that rely heavily on credit, like the American automobile industry. Then, major trading partners of the United States felt the impact. Export-driven economies that depend on American and European demand were hit next. By the end of 2008, some of the world's largest economies were in recession. But Greece had been dealing with a mounting debt crisis as the global recession hit. As a result, Greece had to be bailed out by the IMF and the European Union in 2010. Both organizations, however, compelled Greece to enact spending cuts and tax increases to ensure the bailout money was repaid. And this was very controversial in Greece at the time. So while an increasingly interconnected economy can be beneficial with improving levels of development, it can also have pitfalls as well. As always, this presents a topic about which we should be prepared to talk about both the positives and negatives. That's where we'll leave things for tonight. Have a good evening, everyone. I'll see you back in class.